a successful medical malpractice attorney. His new bride, a vibrant young woman starting her life. And an early Sunday morning in November 1989 that ended in unimaginable violence. This is the story of Dan and Linda Broderick, two victims of a crime that shocked San Diego's elite community and exposed the devastating consequences of unchecked rage and obsession. It's a case that forces us to confront difficult questions about relationships, divorce, and when warning signs cross the line into danger. Before we begin, this case involves domestic conflict, emotional abuse from multiple parties, and gun violence. Please take care of yourself while listening. Welcome to the Mystery Docket, where we bring you real stories of crime, mystery, and the search for justice, always remembering the victims first. Daniel T. Broderick III was born on November 22, 1944, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Those who knew Dan described him as brilliant, ambitious, and deeply driven. He came from a large Catholic family and carried with him traditional values about success and achievement. Dan had worked incredibly hard to build his career, putting himself through medical school at Cornell and then Harvard Law School. By 1989, he had become one of San Diego's most successful medical malpractice attorneys, respected in legal circles and financially prosperous beyond what most people could imagine. But Dan wasn't just his career. He was a father to 4 children whom he loved, even though his relationship with them had become strained. Friends remember him as someone who valued order, control, and doing things the right way. He enjoyed the finer things in life that his success had brought him, from country club memberships to expensive cars. At 44 years old, Dan had finally found personal happiness again after years of a deteriorating marriage. Linda Colquhoun Broderick was born on June 26, 1961, in Salt Lake City, Utah. 28 years old at the time of her death, Linda was described by those who knew her as warm, bubbly, and genuinely kind. She had moved to San Diego to start fresh after a difficult period in her life, and she was building a career in the legal field. Linda loved the beach, enjoyed aerobics classes, and had a close relationship with her family back in Utah. Linda had met Dan when she worked as his legal assistant, and despite the complications and controversy surrounding their relationship, those close to them said she truly loved him. She had become a stepmother figure to Dan's children, even though the situation was incredibly difficult and the kids often rejected her. Linda had dreams of building a life with Dan, perhaps having children of their own, and creating the kind of stable, happy home she'd always wanted. They had married just 7 months before that November morning, on April 22, 1989, hoping that this new chapter would finally bring them peace. To understand what happened to Dan and Linda, we need to understand the relationship that preceded them, and the woman whose rage would ultimately take their lives. In 1965, a young Dan Broderick met Elizabeth and Bisheglia, who went by Betty, at a college party in South Bend, Indiana. Betty was beautiful, vivacious, and came from a well-to-do family in New York. They seemed like the perfect match. Both Catholic, both ambitious, both wanting the kind of successful life that took hard work and dedication. They married in 1969, and Betty became what many would call the ultimate supportive wife. While Dan pursued his medical degree at Cornell, Betty worked multiple jobs to support them financially. She typed his papers, quizzed him for exams, and put her own dreams on hold. When Dan decided to switch careers and attend Harvard Law School, Betty continued to be his anchor, now pregnant with their first child. Over the next several years, they would have 4 children together: Kim, Lee, Daniel Jr., and Rhett. On the surface, the Brodericks looked like they had it all. As Dan's career skyrocketed in San Diego, they moved into increasingly lavish homes, joined the right clubs, and lived the life that Betty had been working toward since the beginning. But beneath that polished exterior, cracks were forming. Betty felt increasingly taken for granted. She had sacrificed her 20s and early 30s to build Dan's career, and now that they had arrived at success, she felt invisible. Dan worked constantly, often coming home late or not at all. Betty began to feel that she was just another item on Dan's to-do list, something to be managed rather than cherished. Friends noticed the tension. Betty would make cutting remarks at parties. Dan would retreat into work. Betty struggled with feeling unappreciated and insecure, especially as Dan's professional world expanded and she felt left behind. What had started as a partnership now felt like a power imbalance, with Dan holding all the cards: the career, the money, the prestige, and the control. Then in 1983, Dan hired a new legal assistant. Her name was Linda Colquhoun, and she was 21 years old, 17 years younger than Dan and 15 years younger than Betty. Linda was attractive, single, and represented everything Betty feared she was losing: youth, possibility, and Dan's attention. Betty's suspicions about Linda started almost immediately. She noticed how often Dan mentioned his new assistant, how late he was working, how distracted he seemed at home. When Betty confronted him, Dan dismissed her concerns, calling her paranoid and jealous. But Betty's instincts were right. By 1985, Dan and Linda's relationship had become romantic, though Dan would later claim it only became physical after he separated from Betty. In February 1985, Dan moved out of the family home on his 39th birthday, telling Betty he needed space. He moved into a bachelor pad and the divorce proceedings began. What followed was one of the most bitter, expensive, and prolonged divorce battles San Diego had ever seen. This is where the red flags began escalating on both sides, creating a toxic spiral that nobody seemed able to stop. Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic and obsessive. She drove her car into the front door of Dan's new house while the children were inside. She left hundreds of profanity-laced messages on Dan's answering machine. She mailed him packages of destroyed clothes. She showed up at his office unannounced, sometimes causing scenes. Betty was consumed by rage, betrayal, and the feeling that her entire life's work had been stolen from her. Dan's response was to use the legal system as a weapon. As a powerful attorney, he knew exactly how to manipulate the proceedings. He restricted Betty's access to their children, using her increasingly unstable behavior as justification. He had her arrested multiple times for violating restraining orders. He delayed financial settlements, leaving Betty feeling powerless despite being entitled to half of their considerable assets. Dan remained calm and controlled in court while Betty appeared hysterical, and he used that contrast to his advantage. The children were caught in the middle, being forced to choose sides in a war neither parent would end. Kim, the oldest, often defended her father. Lee sided more with Betty and would later be disinherited by Dan. The younger boys were confused and traumatized. Friends and family on both sides grew increasingly concerned. Betty's friends watched her mental health deteriorate. She lost weight, couldn't sleep, and talked about nothing but Dan and Linda. Dan's friends worried that he was poking a wounded animal, that his legal tactics were escalating Betty's rage rather than containing it. Some urged him to settle quickly and generously, to give Betty closure so everyone could move on. But Dan wouldn't budge. He seemed to believe that he could control Betty through the courts, that eventually she would exhaust herself and accept defeat. He also wanted to marry Linda, and moving forward with his new life meant resolving the old one on his terms. In April 1989, while the divorce was still not finalized, Dan and Linda got married in an elegant ceremony. Betty was not just replaced, she was erased, as if the 20 years she had devoted to building Dan's life had never happened. The message was clear: Dan had won and Betty had lost everything. Over the following months, Betty's threats became more specific and more frightening. She told friends she wanted Dan dead. She said he deserved to die for what he'd done to her. She talked about how she had nothing left to lose. Multiple people would later testify that they had heard Betty make these threats, but nobody truly believed she would follow through. She was angry, yes, but murder? That seemed impossible for a woman who had once been a devoted wife and mother. They were wrong. On Sunday, November 5, 1989, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, Betty Broderick used a key she had stolen from her daughter Lee to enter Dan and Linda's home in the Marston Hills neighborhood of San Diego. She was carrying a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver that she had purchased several months earlier. Betty would later claim that she only wanted to talk to Dan, to force him to listen to her pain and acknowledge what he had done to her. She said she didn't plan to kill anyone, that she just wanted him to see her, to finally pay attention. But she brought a loaded gun into their bedroom before dawn while they slept. What happened next took less than a minute but changed everything forever. Betty entered the master bedroom where Dan and Linda were sleeping. The room was dark. According to Betty's own testimony, Linda woke up and said something. Betty claims Linda screamed, though the exact words are disputed. Betty fired. Then she fired again. And again. When it was over, Dan Broderick had been shot multiple times. He died in the bedroom. Linda Colkina Broderick, just 28 years old and married for only 7 months, was also shot multiple times. She tried to reach the phone but collapsed in the hallway. She died shortly after. Betty left the house, leaving behind two people who would never see another sunrise, never celebrate another holiday, never have the chance to fulfill any of the dreams they'd been building together. Dan was 44. Linda was 28. Their lives ended because someone's pain had transformed into lethal rage. Betty drove to her daughter Lee's apartment and told her what she had done. Then she turned herself in to the police. When questioned, Betty showed little remorse. She claimed she had been driven to it, that Dan and Linda had destroyed her life and left her no choice. She portrayed herself as the victim, even though she was the one holding the gun. The investigation was relatively straightforward from a forensic standpoint. Betty had confessed. The murder weapon was recovered. The physical evidence at the scene matched her account of entering the home and shooting both victims while they were in bed. But the legal and emotional complexity was anything but simple. As detectives dug into the background, they uncovered years of documented abuse, harassment, and threats from Betty toward Dan. They found the answering machine tapes with her profane messages. They interviewed friends who described Betty's deteriorating mental state and her repeated threats to kill Dan. They also uncovered Dan's legal tactics during the divorce. The way he had used his knowledge of the law to drain Betty financially, to limit her custody of the children, and to maintain control even as the marriage ended. Some investigators felt sympathy for what Betty had endured, though they never questioned that she had committed murder. The prosecutor's office decided to charge Betty with 2 counts of second-degree murder. This was significant because it meant they believed the killings were intentional but not premeditated in the legal sense. The defense would argue that Betty had been driven temporarily insane by years of psychological abuse and that she hadn't planned to kill anyone that morning. What emerged during the investigation was a portrait of a woman who had completely unraveled. Betty had become so consumed by her anger and sense of betrayal that she could no longer distinguish between feeling hurt and causing irreparable harm. She had convinced herself that Dan and Linda were the villains in her story, and that killing them was somehow justified or even necessary for her survival. But 2 people were dead, and no amount of past suffering could justify what Betty had done. Betty Broderick's first trial began in October 1990 and ended in a hung jury. The 12 jurors were deeply divided. Some believed Betty had been pushed to the breaking point by years of emotional and financial abuse from Dan. They saw her as a woman who had given everything to her husband's success, only to be discarded and tormented. These jurors couldn't bring themselves to convict her of murder. Others on the jury saw the case differently. They acknowledged that Betty had suffered during the divorce, but they believed she had choices. She could have walked away. She could have focused on healing and rebuilding her own life. Instead, she had become obsessed with vengeance. She had threatened to kill Dan for years. She had purchased a gun. She had stolen a key to access the house. And on that November morning, she had made a conscious decision to take that gun into their bedroom. To these jurors, this was murder, plain and simple, and Betty needed to be held accountable. The mistrial was controversial and painful for everyone involved. Dan and Linda's families felt that justice had been denied. Betty's supporters felt vindicated, believing that the hung jury proved she had been right all along. But there would be a second trial. In December 1991, Betty Broderick was tried again for the murders of Dan and Linda Broderick. This time, the jury reached a verdict. On December 11, 1991, Betty was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The jury had deliberated for 4 days before reaching their decision. They concluded that while Betty may have been emotionally distraught, she knew what she was doing when she brought that gun into the house. The killing was intentional and she needed to be held responsible. At sentencing, Betty showed little remorse. She continued to justify her actions, claiming that Dan had abused her psychologically and that the legal system had failed to protect her. She portrayed herself as the real victim, even in the face of 2 deaths. The judge sentenced Betty to 32 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The families of Dan and Linda finally had their measure of justice, though nothing could bring back the people they loved. Dan's children were left without their father, and they had to process the knowledge that their mother had killed him. Some of the children maintained relationships with Betty in prison. Others cut off contact completely. The trauma of what happened fractured the family in ways that would never fully heal. Linda's family spoke about the bright, kind woman they had lost. A woman who had been excited about her future, who had loved Dan deeply, and who had done nothing to deserve the violence that ended her life. Linda had become collateral damage in Betty's war against Dan, and her family struggled with the unfairness of her death. Betty Broderick has been denied parole multiple times. As of the last hearing, she continues to maintain that she was driven to murder by Dan's abusive behavior during the divorce. She has expressed some regret but has never fully accepted responsibility for choosing to kill two people. She remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino, California. The Betty Broderick case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic conflict, divorce, and the justice system. Betty experienced real emotional and financial abuse during her divorce from Dan. His legal tactics were cruel and controlling. He did use his power as an attorney to manipulate the proceedings and maintain control over Betty's life. Those things are true and they matter. But here's what also matters. Dan and Linda Broderick were murdered. They were killed while they slept in their own home. They didn't deserve to die. No amount of past suffering, no matter how real or painful, justifies taking someone's life. Betty had options. She could have walked away. She could have sought therapy. She could have focused on building a new life for herself. Instead, she chose violence, and that choice cost two people everything. This case shows us how dangerous it is when hurt transforms into obsession. Betty spent years consumed by rage, and that rage poisoned everything in her life. Her relationship with her children, her mental health, and ultimately her freedom. She allowed Dan to occupy so much space in her mind that she couldn't see a future that didn't include him, even if that meant destroying him. There are warning signs here for all of us. When someone in your life won't stop talking about revenge or how someone deserves to be hurt, that's a red flag. When someone purchases a weapon while in the middle of emotional turmoil, that's a red flag. When someone's anger doesn't diminish over time but instead intensifies and becomes more specific, that's a red flag. Multiple people in Betty's life heard her threaten to kill Dan, but nobody took serious action to prevent it. If you're going through a difficult divorce or separation, please know that your feelings of anger and betrayal are valid. But there are healthy ways to process those feelings, and there are resources available to help you heal. The National Domestic Violence Hotline doesn't just help people experiencing physical violence. They also provide support for emotional and financial abuse during relationships and divorces. You don't have to let your pain define the rest of your life. And if someone you know is making threats or showing signs of escalating rage, take it seriously. Intervene. Contact authorities. Encourage therapy. Don't assume that because someone seems rational in other areas of their life, they won't follow through on violent threats. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who convince themselves they're completely justified in their anger. Dan and Linda Broderick deserved to live. They deserved to build the future they had planned together. Their deaths were a tragedy that never should have happened. Thank you for watching the Mystery Docket. This case is difficult and complex, and I appreciate you taking the time to engage with these important conversations about domestic conflict, warning signs, and justice. If you found value in this respectful approach to true crime, please consider subscribing to help us continue sharing stories that honor victims and provide meaningful insights. What are your thoughts about the Betty Broderick case? How do we balance acknowledging someone's pain while still holding them accountable for their actions? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below, keeping the conversation respectful as always. Remember, victims first always.